6 dramatic Golden Age stars who were secretly really funny. Hollywood spent millions creating images. The brooding intellectual, the ice queen, the tragic beauty, every photograph, every interview, every publicity release carefully crafted to project exactly the right persona. For Laurence Olivier, that image was Shakespearean gravitas, the man who embodied theater's highest traditions, someone you'd expect to discuss iambic pentameter over brandy while wearing a smoking jacket. But behind closed doors, Olivier spent his time doing devastating impressions of Marlon Brando ordering a cheeseburger. "I walked onto set expecting to meet this terrifying Shakespearean god," recalled a young actor who worked with Olivier in the 1960s. Instead, he spent 20 minutes doing Brando in a cowboy hat. I nearly passed out from laughing. And he wasn't the only one. Bette Davis, Hollywood's ultimate ice queen, had a backstage reputation so shockingly different from her public image that new crew members literally wouldn't believe the stories until they witnessed her humor firsthand. The elegant voice who narrated Casablanca? Between takes, he recited limericks so filthy they'd make a sailor blush, delivered in that same pristine accent. And the mysterious Garbo, famous for wanting to be alone? She spent an entire week pretending to be her own maid just to mess with an obsessed fan. These weren't just actors who happened to be funny. These were genuinely hilarious people, trapped inside images that had nothing to do with who they really were. The studios had invested too much money in their carefully crafted personas to let audiences see the truth. The distance between who they were and who the public thought they were wasn't just notable, it was absurd. And the stories of how they maintained their sanity while living these double lives revealed just how manufactured Golden Age Hollywood truly was. But first, you need to hear about the Shakespearean legend who destroyed method actors for sport, and the backstage incident that left an entire production crying with laughter.
Wings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble.
Laurence Olivier, the actor who performed Hamlet in a cowboy accent. When audiences thought of Laurence Olivier, they pictured intensity, the man who made Shakespeare feel alive, someone so serious about acting that watching him felt like witnessing history. His performances in Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III weren't just good, they were definitive. Critics ran out of superlatives. This was the greatest classical actor of his generation, possibly ever. Behind the scenes, Olivier was doing Marlon Brando impressions and making people cry laughing. "Larry could destroy you with comedy," recalled Michael Caine, who worked with Olivier multiple times. He had this wicked gift for mimicry. He could capture anyone's exact mannerisms and make them look absolutely ridiculous. And he had zero mercy. Olivier's favorite targets were method actors, the new generation who approached roles with intense psychological preparation that Olivier found pretentious and unnecessarily complicated. When Dustin Hoffman stayed awake for days to prepare for an exhausted scene in Marathon Man, Olivier's response became famous. "My dear boy, why don't you just try acting?" But that was the polite public version. The private version was far funnier and far more brutal. According to crew members on various productions, Olivier spent breaks doing elaborate parodies of method actors. He'd mumble incoherently, reference childhood traumas that never happened, claim he needed to find the emotional truth of picking up this coffee cup. He once spent an entire lunch break pretending to be a method actor preparing to play a tree, remembered a script supervisor from a 1960s production, complete with backstory about the tree's relationship with its forest, how childhood storms created lasting trauma. People were crying with laughter. But Olivier saved his most devastating impression for Brando, the mumbling, naturalistic style that represented everything Olivier found baffling about modern acting. Larry's Brando was so accurate it was almost cruel, recalled an actress who appeared in several productions with him. He'd scratch himself, look at the floor, mumble something incomprehensible, then look up in his normal voice and say, "That'll be $50,000, please." Even people who loved Brando couldn't help laughing. The story about Olivier performing Hamlet in a cowboy accent isn't Hollywood legend. It actually happened. Multiple sources confirm it occurred during a particularly tense rehearsal. The director was being demanding, the cast was exhausted, everyone was at the breaking point. Then Olivier suddenly launched into "to be or not to be" in a perfect Wild West drawl. To be or not to be, partner? That's the question, ain't it? The entire production collapsed. People were literally on the floor. "It was like watching someone deflate a balloon," recalled a stage manager who was there. "All that tension just evaporated. We got back to work and nailed the scene on the next take." What makes this particularly remarkable is how completely Olivier's public image concealed this side of him. Interviews showed a thoughtful, serious man discussing craft with intense focus. Publicity materials presented him as the embodiment of theatrical tradition. The clowning Olivier? That stayed backstage, hidden from audiences who preferred their Shakespearean actors appropriately solemn. But if Olivier hid his humor behind theatrical gravitas, the next star on our list wrapped hers in something even more impenetrable, the image of Hollywood's most terrifying ice queen.
Miss Davis, ever since I've been on this set, I've heard nothing but discussion of Eve. May I have your opinion of her?
The golden girl, the cover girl.
Bette Davis, the ice queen who used humor like a weapon. Those eyes, that voice, the severe expressions that made Bette Davis one of Hollywood's most formidable dramatic actresses. For decades, Davis embodied a particular type of character, strong, uncompromising, often cold. Her performances in All About Eve, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and Jezebel created an image of someone untouchable, even frightening. Press coverage emphasized her professionalism, her demands for respect, her reputation as someone you didn't cross. What the publicity machine carefully avoided mentioning was that Davis was also one of the funniest people in Hollywood. Betty didn't suffer fools, but she also didn't suffer boredom, remembered Olivia de Havilland. If a scene or conversation got too serious, she'd throw out a line so perfectly timed and so devastatingly funny that everything would stop. Davis's humor wasn't gentle. It was sharp, observational, and often delivered with the same intensity she brought to dramatic roles. Her most famous line, "Old age ain't no place for sissies," perfectly captures her style. Honest, tough, undeniably funny. On set, Davis became legendary for breaking tension with perfectly timed zingers. During All About Eve, the production was struggling with a complicated party scene. Dozens of extras, complex blocking, and after the seventh failed take, the director was growing frustrated and the cast was getting tense. Davis looked around the crowded set and announced, "Well, this is what hell looks like, darlings. I always wondered." The entire production dissolved into laughter. The tension evaporated. The next take worked perfectly. She had this gift for saying what everyone was thinking, recalled a script supervisor who worked on several Davis films, but in a way that made it funny instead of just mean, though sometimes it was definitely mean, but hilariously so. Davis's targets were usually those she felt deserved deflating: pompous directors, self-important actors, studio executives who treated filmmaking like factory work. Young actors who took themselves too seriously quickly learned that Davis would find their weak point and exploit it. During one 1950s production, a young method actor was taking an extraordinarily long time to prepare for a simple scene. Elaborate psychological preparations while the crew waited. Davis watched this performance of preparation for several minutes before announcing in her distinctive voice, "Darling, in the time you've spent finding your motivation, I could have shot 3 pictures and won another Oscar. Shall we try acting instead?" The crew desperately tried not to laugh. The young actor got the message and completed the scene on the next take. But Davis didn't just mock others, she mocked herself. She would do these exaggerated versions of her own performances, remembered a makeup artist who worked with Davis for years. She'd recreate famous scenes, but with ridiculous additions. Jezebel ordering a pizza, Baby Jane doing aerobics. She knew exactly how to puncture the seriousness around her image. What makes Davis's hidden comedy particularly striking is how rarely audiences saw this side of her. Studio publicity maintained the image of Davis as fierce and formidable, which she was, but carefully edited out the humor that made her fully human. Late in her career, Davis finally started showing glimpses of this personality on talk shows. But by then, her image was so established that many viewers thought they were seeing a new development rather than something she'd always been. While Davis used humor as a weapon to maintain control, the next star on our list wielded comedy with such deadpan commitment that people couldn't tell if he was joking or genuinely insane.
That's it. Sit on a rock in the middle of Lake Michigan, pick your nose, examine your navel. Call that getting out of it?
James Mason, the villain who gave his cats Shakespearean backstories. James Mason's voice was one of cinema's most distinctive instruments. Deep, refined, with perfect enunciation that made even simple dialogue sound profound. His roles as cold aristocrats and calculating villains established him as Hollywood's go-to actor for sophisticated menace. Films like North by Northwest, A Star is Born, and Lolita showcased Mason's ability to project intelligence and barely concealed danger. His public persona matched these roles. thoughtful interviews, reserved demeanor, a certain British propriety. Then you'd visit his home and discover he'd been narrating his cat's daily activities in full Shakespearean monologue for the past 20 minutes. James had this completely deadpan sense of humor, recalled Roddy McDowall. He would say the most absurd things in that serious voice. Half the time you couldn't tell if he was joking or genuinely believed his cat was plotting to overthrow the household. Mason owned several cats throughout his life and became infamous among friends for his elaborate narratives about their interior lives, delivered with the same gravitas he brought to playing Brutus. He'd narrate entire scenes, remembered a frequent dinner guest. His cat would walk across the room and James would announce, "Thus does Macbeth approach the throne, murder in his heart and tuna on his breath." Completely straight face, as if this were perfectly normal. What made Mason's humor particularly effective was his absolute commitment. Unlike comedians who signal jokes with tone or expression, Mason maintained the same serious demeanor whether discussing Chekhov or explaining why his cat was clearly staging a coup. "You'd be having a perfectly serious conversation about politics," recalled a colleague, and James would suddenly interject, "Forgive the interruption, but Pericles, his cat, has just made an extremely compelling argument about foreign policy through the medium of knocking over that plant." Same serious tone. For a moment, you'd question your own sanity. On film sets, Mason's dry wit became legendary. During particularly overwrought dramatic scenes, he would occasionally slip in absurd line readings during rehearsals, delivered with such conviction that directors sometimes wouldn't notice until the third or fourth repetition. "We were blocking this intense confrontation scene," recalled a director from the 1960s. James had this line about betrayal and trust. During rehearsal, he suddenly delivered it as, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth to have a thankless accountant." Same serious tone, same intensity. We used it for 5 minutes before anyone realized he'd changed the line. Mason's humor extended to his willingness to puncture Hollywood's self-importance. At dinner parties where actors discussed their craft with intense seriousness, Mason would occasionally contribute observations like, "Yes, the challenge of finding truth in character is profound, almost as challenging as my cat's ongoing struggle to coexist peacefully with the vacuum cleaner." What makes Mason's hidden comedy particularly fascinating is how invisible it was to film audiences. His screen performances contain no hint of the absurdist sensibility that dominated his private life. The control required to maintain such complete separation between public and private personas speaks to Mason's skill as an actor, but also to the rigid image management that Golden Age Hollywood demanded. The studios would have had a fit if they'd known James was at home narrating cat dramas in Shakespearean verse, noted a crew member. That wasn't the image they'd cultivated, so James kept that side private. If Mason's humor operated through deadpan commitment, the next star deployed comedy with the opposite approach. Chaotic, physical energy that stood in shocking contrast to her image as aristocratic royalty. Katharine Hepburn, the patrician who mooned directors. Katharine Hepburn represented a very specific image to American audiences. The intelligent, independent woman with New England breeding and aristocratic bearing, her distinctive accent, her refusal to conform to Hollywood's beauty standards, her carefully maintained privacy, everything created an image of untouchable class. Her performances in The Philadelphia Story, The African Queen, and Bringing Up Baby showcased Hepburn's intelligence and sophistication. Interviews presented her as thoughtful and serious. Everything about her public image suggested refinement. The reality, considerably more chaotic. Kate was absolutely bonkers in the best way, remembered director George Cukor, who worked with Hepburn on multiple films. She'd pull the most outrageous stunts, use language that would make a sailor blush, and had absolutely zero patience for pretension. Hepburn's pranks became legendary in Hollywood circles, though the studio publicity machine worked overtime to keep them from public knowledge. She would hide props, rearrange sets overnight, once allegedly filled a pompous actor's dressing room with chickens. She thought Hollywood took itself far too seriously, recalled a production assistant. Anytime things got too stuffy, Kate would do something to puncture the balloon, usually something physical and usually hilarious. But the incident that best captures Hepburn's hidden personality involves a director whose sexist comments finally pushed her too far. The story has been confirmed by multiple sources, though details vary depending on who's telling it. During a 1940s production, the director, known for his difficult personality, made a comment about women not understanding technical aspects of filmmaking. Hepburn had been dealing with his condescension throughout the shoot. She listened to this particular remark in silence. Then she stood up, turned around, lifted her skirt, and mooned him, in front of the entire crew. There was this moment of absolute silence, recalled an assistant director who witnessed it. Then Kate turned back around, looked at him very seriously, and said, "Now perhaps you'll remember that even women's asses are more interesting than your opinions about cinematography." The crew exploded in laughter. The director stood speechless. Hepburn calmly walked back to her mark and suggested they continue with the scene. "The amazing thing was that she did it with such total confidence," the assistant director continued. "No embarrassment, no hesitation. She made her point and moved on. The director never made another sexist comment in her presence." Hepburn's language was another aspect carefully hidden from public view. Multiple sources describe her vocabulary as shocking, even by industry standards. "She could swear in ways I'd never heard," remembered Spencer Tracy, Hepburn's longtime partner, "and she'd do it in that patrician accent, which somehow made it funnier. A string of profanity delivered in a tone usually reserved for discussing Shakespeare." On set, Hepburn's energy stood in stark contrast to her controlled performances. Between takes, she was in constant motion, doing handstands, climbing set pieces, engaging in rapid-fire banter with crew members. She acted like royalty on screen, but backstage was more like a very athletic Marx brother, recalled a cinematographer from the 1950s. She'd be dangling from rafters one minute, delivering a perfectly composed, dramatic performance the next. What makes Hepburn's hidden personality particularly interesting is that glimpses occasionally leaked into her performances, especially in screwball comedies like Bringing Up Baby, where her character's chaotic energy mirrors Hepburn's off-screen personality more closely than her dramatic roles. "Those screwball comedies were actually closer to the real Kate," observed one crew member, "but the industry and the public preferred the serious, sophisticated Hepburn. So that's the image that dominated." While Hepburn used physical comedy and outrageous behavior to deflate pomposity, the next star deployed humor with weaponized precision, making the dirtiest jokes imaginable sound like high culture.
Stop where you are. You don't know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing, all right. Come on. Get all of him.
Claude Rains, the elegant voice reciting filthy limericks. Claude Rains never achieved household name recognition, partly because his most famous role rendered him literally invisible. As the title character in The Invisible Man, audiences never saw his face. They only heard that extraordinary voice. Rich, cultured, impeccably controlled, the kind of voice that made everything sound important. When Rains spoke, whether as Captain Renault in Casablanca or Senator Payne in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, audiences heard sophistication and intelligence. What they didn't hear were the extraordinarily filthy limericks Rains recited between takes in that same elegant voice. "Claude had the dirtiest sense of humor of anyone I've ever met," recalled Bette Davis, who starred with Rains in several films, and the contrast between the content and his delivery made it 100 times funnier. He could make the most obscene limerick sound like Shakespeare. Rains had learned these limericks during his early years in British theater, where bawdy humor thrived behind the scenes. He collected them throughout his career, memorizing hundreds and deploying them strategically to break tension during long shooting days. We'd be setting up a shot, and Claude would be standing there looking distinguished in his costume, remembered a grip who worked on multiple Rains productions. Then he'd launch into this absolutely filthy limerick about a sailor and a farmyard animal, never breaking that serious expression. The sound guys would be scrambling to make sure he wasn't near a hot microphone. The remarkable thing about Rains's humor was his commitment to the contrast. He never performed the limericks as comedy. He recited them with the same precise diction and serious tone he used for classical theater. "That was what made it so funny," explained a co-star. "Claude would deliver the most obscene content in a voice usually reserved for declaring war or pronouncing someone guilty of treason. Your brain couldn't process the disconnect." Rains's humor extended beyond memorized limericks. He had a gift for improvising suggestive double meanings in seemingly innocent lines, a skill he occasionally smuggled into actual performances in ways that flew over censors' heads but delighted knowing cast members. During Casablanca, Claude would sometimes deliver perfectly innocent lines from the script with just the slightest emphasis that made them sound dirty, recalled a script supervisor. The censors never caught it because on paper the lines were fine, but on set, everyone would be trying not to laugh. One of Raines's most famous bits involved reciting Shakespeare in a way that highlighted, or invented, sexual innuendos. He could make "to be or not to be" sound vaguely obscene simply through strategic pauses and subtle emphasis. He'd do whole scenes from Hamlet, remembered a colleague, making them sound like instructions for some bizarre bedroom activity. Then he'd look around innocently and say, "What? It's Shakespeare. High culture." Meanwhile, everyone was crying with laughter. What makes Raines's hidden humor particularly poignant is that his refined voice was actually the result of tremendous effort. Raines had struggled with a speech impediment in his youth and worked for years to develop the precise diction that became his trademark. The voice that sounded so naturally elegant was actually the product of enormous discipline, noted a voice coach, which makes his choice to use it for dirty limericks even funnier. He'd worked so hard to sound sophisticated, then deliberately used that sophistication for the most unsophisticated content imaginable. As with so many of these stars, the public never saw this side of Raines. Publicity materials emphasized his theatrical training, his distinguished filmography, his cultured background. The idea that this elegant voice spent downtime reciting limericks that would make dock workers blush, carefully kept from audiences who preferred their British character actors appropriately refined. If Raines used his cultured voice to disguise outrageous content, our final star deployed humor in perhaps the most unexpected way. The woman famous for wanting to be alone actually wanted to make people laugh.
Who just sent me the first talking picture? You see, I was not there.
Greta Garbo, the mysterious recluse who pretended to be her own maid. I want to be alone. 3 words that defined Greta Garbo's public image for decades. The Swedish actress who became one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the late 20s and 30s cultivated an image of mystery, melancholy, and isolation that fascinated audiences worldwide. Her performances in Grand Hotel, Anna Karenina, and Ninochka established Garbo as the embodiment of tragic beauty. Her famous reclusiveness, she rarely gave interviews, avoided publicity events, eventually retreated from public life entirely, only enhanced the mystique. Everything about Garbo's public persona suggested someone who took herself and life extremely seriously. The idea that she might have a sense of humor seemed almost contradictory to the carefully maintained image. Yet according to those who actually knew her, Garbo was one of Hollywood's most dedicated practical jokers. Greta was hilarious, recalled photographer Cecil Beaton, one of Garbo's close friends. She had this completely absurd sense of humor that nobody would believe if I described it. The serious, tragic Garbo was essentially a character she played. Garbo's pranks often involved assuming false identities, a hobby that began as practical necessity to avoid recognition, but evolved into something she genuinely enjoyed. She loved seeing if she could fool people, remembered a friend. She'd check into hotels under ridiculous fake names, Harriet Brown was a favorite, and see how long she could maintain the deception. But Garbo's most elaborate prank involved pretending to be her own maid for an entire week. A friend had invited Garbo to visit, but also had a house guest, an obsessed Garbo fan who wouldn't stop talking about how mysterious and fascinating the actress was. Garbo, amused by this second-hand worship, convinced her friend to introduce her as Greta, the new Swedish maid. For 7 days, she served meals, cleaned rooms, and listened to the house guest rhapsodize about the real Greta Garbo's mystique and beauty. The guest kept saying things like, "I'd give anything to meet her," while Garbo was literally handing her coffee, the friend recalled years later. Greta found it absolutely delicious. She'd come back to the kitchen and have to stuff a towel in her mouth to keep from laughing. On the final day, Garbo revealed her true identity. The guest's reaction was apparently so extreme that Garbo felt genuinely bad about the deception, but not bad enough to stop telling the story at dinner parties for years afterward. Garbo's humor extended to her approach to her own image. Friends describe her doing exaggerated imitations of herself, widening her eyes dramatically and saying in a thick accent, "I want to be alone," mocking the very mystique that had made her famous. She thought the whole thing was rather ridiculous, recalled a close friend. The way people treated her like this untouchable goddess. She'd joke about it constantly with people she trusted. Even Garbo's famous reclusiveness, while certainly real, had an element of humor to it. She would occasionally venture out in elaborate disguises, then be amused when people didn't recognize her, or when they did. She told me once that the disguises were partly practical and partly just fun, remembered photographer George Hoyningen-Huene. She enjoyed the game of it. seeing how ordinary she could make herself look. What makes Garbo's hidden humor particularly fascinating is how completely it contradicted her public image. While other stars on this list had to hide their comedy to maintain dramatic credibility, Garbo's entire mystique was built on silence and mystery, characteristics fundamentally opposed to comedy's need for expression and revelation. If people had known Greta was pulling pranks and making jokes, it would have completely destroyed the image the studio had spent millions creating, noted one crew member. So that side of her stayed absolutely private, shared only with close friends who could be trusted not to tell. Late in life, when Garbo had fully retreated from public view, those close to her report that her sense of humor remained intact. She'd see someone on television and say something devastatingly funny about them, recalled a companion from Garbo's later years. She remained sharp and observant until the end. The tragedy was that most of the world never knew that side of her existed.